My name is Winston Shaw, and I'm from Nicosia Period 7 Academic Bio. And I'm here today to talk to you about Marfan Syndrome. A basic description of Marfan Syndrome is a hereditary disorder in which limbs are lengthened because of a defect in the joints. A person such as like this has disproportionate limbs in comparison to their torso. The results are typically, as I mentioned before, long limbs. As you can see, his arms are extremely long and thin, as well as his legs. Marfan syndrome does not target a specific ethnic group or gender. It is found commonly in all races and all genders. Why was I interested in Marfan syndrome? That's a very interesting question. I was interested in this syndrome because at first my mother, maybe 10, 15 years ago, my mother believed that her younger brother, who was my uncle, had the disease because he was 6'5", which is an extremely tall height for people of that background, and also he had extremely long limbs and long fingers. And my mom knew about this disease, so she advised that he should have a physical exam and see what was up with the case. And the doctor told him that he did not have any sort of disease at all, but he was just an outlier in our family. So the other reason why the doctor said he didn't have a disease is because he didn't have any back or heart problems, which are actually pretty big problems in Marfan syndrome. So what are some signs and symptoms of Marfan syndrome? Extremely slender and tall, long limbs disproportionate to the body, such as picture here. It indicates 3 members of the family and their father, each one with extremely long arms and extremely long fingers. Also very long legs. The father is less visible because he is older than all of them, and Marfan syndrome is more obvious in younger age people. Another sign and symptom of Marfan syndrome is scoliosis and flat feet. Many people have flat feet, but when you have both of them, it is very likely that you may have some case of Marfan syndrome partnered with the fact that you have long limbs, and yeah. Dislocation of one or both lenses of the eyes. Another problem that people with Marfan syndrome encounter is that they will have poor vision, normally nearsightedness, which is the flattening of the eye. Another problem people will have is aortic dissection, which is a more severe case which is obvious in more severe cases of Marfan syndromes, where the aorta will clot because it is too thin and very weak, because of the limbs being more outstretched and the arteries being needed to travel farther distances. Shortness of breath, fatigue, can also be cases of Marfan syndrome because of, you have longer limbs and you need more energy to supply those limbs. Dural ectasia, which is the ruining of the back. This is a very, very obvious case of scoliosis. As you can see, the spine is curved here, which isn't supposed to be happening. It's actually supposed to be straight, which is a normal spine. And the membrane of this spine is slowly wearing away because of the height of the person. So that can cause discomfort in the abdomen and weakness in the legs. A smaller and more minor and less harmful case of a symptom of Marfan syndrome is random stretch marks on the body. So you may have them on your arm, on your shoulder, on your stomach, but that's because your skin is being stretched because your limbs are so long. And that's a picture of the eye being flattened here, which is an example of nearsightedness. So how does this disease affect the body? Alright, we touched upon this before. It results in unnatural elongation of limbs due to connective tissue defect. And it affects the circulatory system because, as mentioned before, arteries need to travel a greater distance to supply the limbs with blood that they need to operate. So this can mean that the arteries can break any time because they're stretched out to such a thin point that any strenuous activity may damage them. It can affect eyesight, as shown in this picture, where nearsightedness is prevalent, and increased flexibility due to the less restraint in joints. So if you had Marfan syndrome, you would probably be able to bend your fingers back a lot more. Maybe wrap your entire hand around your thumb because your thumb is extra long. So then, what does it all have to do with DNA? Well, Marfan syndrome is because the lack of FBN1, which is a protein that builds up strands, which are microfibers in your joints that help your joints stay strong and also well functioning. The mutation causes a lack of these fibers, making limbs longer than they actually are supposed to be. And Marfan syndrome occurs in 1 of every 5,000 people, but that's only for random mutations. And I'll talk about inheritance patterns later on. What does it have to do with protein synthesis and mutations? Alright, fibrillin 1 is a protein. So, therefore, when chromosome 15 is duplicated and there is a malfunctioning inside the chromosome, this fibrillin 1 is not coded into the instructions for DNA. So, a person that has this defect won't have his or her cells knowing to make fibrillin 1 to support the joints. This displays an error in synthesis, as the gene in the chromosome is not properly copied. Flexibility. And this is fibrillin 1 in smaller genetic form. This is a deletion mutation, as certain parts of the codon that program FBN1 into genes are deleted. So, on a molecular level, that's what causes this disease or syndrome. And on a less molecular level, however, in the body, fibrillin 1 is actually a protein that almost completely makes up these strands. So when you're missing this fibrillin 1, these strands aren't existent at all, which causes your limbs to be not disfigured, but long, as said plenty of times before. So, how are meiosis and genetics related? Well, Marfan is a dominant trait, which means any parent that has Marfan syndrome will have a 50% chance of passing it on to their child. There are no carriers for Marfan syndrome because Marfan syndrome, interestingly enough, is a dominant trait. That means if you say, let's say one parent is capital M and then small m, they will have Marfan syndrome because Marfan syndrome is a dominant trait, as if the capital M is representing Marfan syndrome. So if a child receives an allele of capital M, he/she will exhibit traits of Marfan. And there's no such thing as carriers for Marfan because it's a dominant trait, as said before. Parent must have Marfan in order for a child to receive this disease. So, since there are no carriers, you can't really have a child that has Marfan if you don't have Marfan yourself, unless that child is 1 in 5,000 who gets the disease from a mutation. So, how is biotechnology related to Marfan syndrome? And this shows how Marfan syndrome is caused by deletions of exons. And this is a part of the chromosome in which Marfan syndrome is located, right here. Specific part, which is in the middle of the chromosome. Scientists are researching a transforming growth factor beta. So scientists are testing mice with Marfan syndrome to see if there's any possible way to rearrange the genes or manipulate DNA in order to prevent the later stages of Marfan syndrome, because when you're a child, it's pretty obvious that you have it, but if you're an infant, the effects haven't begun to set in yet. So before birth, maybe scientists may use biotechnology to manipulate genes in order to avoid the troubles with Marfan syndrome. Another approach being taken is to understand what happens when the genetic mutation occurs, which involves exons being altered. But as mentioned before, this is a deletion mutation, which means exons are going missing instead of being substituted or inserted or anything like that. So scientists have to find a way to replace these exons with synthetic exons if that's possible. So this is a rat showing, this is a normal mouse with, a normal spinal cord and everything. But however, this is a mouse afflicted by Marfan syndrome, as you can tell by its hunched back and more curvy spine figure. Alright, so how is a person's daily life affected? People with Marfan syndrome cannot undergo as much strenuous exercise as a person without Marfan syndrome, and they might not be able to do a good deal of intense sports, such as some of them being boxing, rugby, weightlifting, skydiving, deep sea diving, karate, and wrestling, which are all pretty physically intensive sports. One afflicted with disease must always worry about what kind of work they're putting themselves through. They shouldn't give themselves too high blood pressure because, as mentioned before, arteries are very weak when you have Marfan syndrome, and it's very easy for these arteries to implode or erupt, causing dilations in the blood. And you can't put too much stress on the cardiovascular system. So if you have Marfan syndrome, don't overwork yourself to the point where your heart rate is extremely high. And you must be careful to have a low blood pressure, as a high one may result in a cardiovascular issue and may result in artery damage. My name is Winston Shaw, and this was my presentation on Marfan syndrome. Thank you for watching.